In 1971, a young construction worker named Michael Garrett vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a family desperate for answers. No body, no ransom demands, no witnesses. The police investigation stalled within months, and the case was quietly filed away as another unsolved missing person report. For 5 decades, his disappearance remained one of those mysteries that fade from memory, buried beneath newer crimes and forgotten headlines. But in 2022, during what should have been a routine kitchen renovation in a suburban home outside Denver, a contractor's sledgehammer broke through more than just drywall. What they found hidden behind that wall wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was proof of a conspiracy that had been carefully constructed, deliberately concealed, and successfully maintained for over half a century. The discovery didn't happen all at once. It began with a single loose brick, a minor structural inconsistency that caught the attention of a detail-oriented contractor. But that one brick led to another, and then another, until what started as a simple home improvement project became the key to unlocking a case that law enforcement had given up on decades earlier. The homeowners had no idea they were living above one of the most elaborate cover-ups in Colorado criminal history. Before we dive deeper into how a missing person case from 1971 finally found its resolution through a kitchen renovation, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Michael Garrett was 28 years old when he disappeared on a cold February morning in 1971. He was known as a reliable worker, someone who showed up on time and finished what he started. His colleagues at Rocky Mountain Construction described him as quiet but dependable, the kind of man who kept his head down and did his job without complaint. He lived alone in a modest apartment on the east side of Denver, drove a used pickup truck, and had no known enemies or debts that might explain his sudden disappearance. On February 15, 1971, Garrett was scheduled to begin work on a residential project in the affluent Highlands Ranch area. The job was straightforward, a basement renovation for a family named the Hendersons. It was supposed to be a 3-week project, maybe 4 if the weather didn't cooperate. Garrett had been looking forward to the work. The pay was good and the location was convenient. He'd driven past the house the evening before to get a sense of the layout, and had even mentioned to his landlord that this job might help him save enough money to move into a better place. But Michael Garrett never made it to that job site. His truck was found 3 days later in a parking lot near the South Platte River, unlocked and undisturbed. His wallet was still in the glove compartment. His tools were in the back. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone or why he might have left voluntarily. The truck had been wiped clean of fingerprints, but that detail wouldn't be discovered until weeks later when the forensics team finally processed the vehicle. The initial investigation was handled by Detective Raymond Costa, a veteran investigator with over 15 years of experience in missing persons cases. Costa interviewed Garrett's co-workers, his neighbors, and the few friends he had maintained since moving to Denver 2 years earlier. Everyone told the same story. Michael was predictable, responsible, and showed no signs of wanting to disappear. He had no romantic entanglements, no gambling debts, no history of mental illness or substance abuse. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of person who doesn't just vanish. The Henderson family, who had hired Garrett for the basement renovation, were cooperative but offered little useful information. They had spoken to him only briefly during the initial consultation and had never met him in person after that. The project had been arranged through Rocky Mountain Construction, and all communication had gone through the company's office manager. The Hendersons expressed sympathy for Garrett's family, but seemed genuinely puzzled by his disappearance. They had been looking forward to the renovation and were disappointed that it would now be delayed. Costa's investigation expanded to include financial records, phone logs, and surveillance footage from businesses near where Garrett's truck was found. The financial records showed nothing unusual. Garrett's bank account had a modest balance, and there had been no large withdrawals or deposits in the weeks before his disappearance. His phone records were equally unremarkable, mostly calls to work contacts and a few conversations with his sister in Wyoming. The surveillance footage from the parking lot area was either missing or too grainy to provide useful information. After 3 months of investigation, Costa had exhausted every conventional lead. He had interviewed over 40 people, followed up on dozens of tips from the public, and coordinated with law enforcement agencies across Colorado and neighboring states. The case generated some media attention initially, but without new developments, public interest quickly faded. Local newspapers ran a few follow-up stories, but by summer 1971, Michael Garrett's disappearance had become just another cold case. The official file remained open, but active investigation ceased. Costa was reassigned to newer cases, and Garrett's disappearance joined the growing stack of unsolved missing person reports that accumulated in police departments across the country. His sister called regularly for updates, but there was little Costa could tell her. The case had simply gone cold. What nobody knew at the time was that Michael Garrett's disappearance wasn't random. It wasn't the result of a crime of opportunity or a spontaneous decision to start a new life somewhere else. It was the culmination of a carefully planned operation that had been months in the making. The construction job at the Henderson house wasn't just a renovation project. It was a setup, designed to place Garrett in a specific location at a specific time, away from witnesses and under the control of people who had been watching him for weeks. The truth about what happened to Michael Garrett had been hidden in plain sight for over 50 years, concealed behind a wall that thousands of people had walked past without ever suspecting what lay just inches away. The cover-up wasn't the work of sophisticated criminals or organized crime figures. It was orchestrated by ordinary people who had extraordinary reasons to make Michael Garrett disappear, and who possessed the patience and resources to keep their secret buried for decades. In 2022, 51 years after Michael Garrett vanished, a family named the Kowalskis purchased a 1960s ranch-style home in what had once been the Highlands Ranch area. The house had changed hands multiple times over the years, but its basic structure remained largely unchanged. The kitchen was outdated, the bathrooms needed work, and the basement had that musty smell that suggested moisture problems. It was exactly the kind of property that attracted young families looking for a fixer-upper in a good neighborhood. The Kowalskis hired a local contractor named David Chen to handle the renovation. Chen had been in the construction business for over 20 years and had developed a reputation for thorough, detail-oriented work. He wasn't the cheapest contractor in the area, but he was known for finding problems that other workers might miss and for taking the time to do things right the first time. Chen began the kitchen renovation on a Tuesday morning in March. The plan was to remove the existing cabinets, update the electrical and plumbing, and install new flooring throughout the space. It was supposed to be a straightforward 6-week project. The Kowalskis had moved in with relatives temporarily, giving Chen complete access to work without interruption. The first sign that something was unusual came when Chen began removing the cabinet that sat against the north wall of the kitchen. The wall behind it felt different somehow, less solid than the others. When he tapped it with his hammer, the sound was hollow, as if there was empty space behind the drywall. Chen had encountered plenty of odd construction choices over the years, but this particular wall seemed to have been added later, after the original construction was complete. Chen mentioned his observation to Mrs. Kowalski when she stopped by to check on the progress. She was curious about the hollow sound and asked if it might indicate a problem with the foundation or the structural integrity of the house. Chen assured her that it was probably nothing serious, maybe just an old utility chase or storage space that had been walled over during a previous renovation. but his professional instincts told him to investigate further. When Chen began carefully removing sections of the drywall, he discovered that the wall was indeed a later addition. The construction was sloppy, clearly done by someone who wasn't a professional contractor. The studs weren't properly spaced, the insulation was minimal, and the electrical work behind the wall violated several building codes. But what caught Chen's attention wasn't the poor workmanship, it was the smell. As he pulled away more drywall, a musty chemical odor began to fill the kitchen. It wasn't the typical smell of old insulation or water damage. This was something else entirely, something that made Chen instinctively step back and reach for his respirator. He'd encountered enough renovation projects to know when something wasn't right, and this definitely wasn't right. Chen called Mrs. Kowalski and suggested they might want to have the area inspected before proceeding further. He couldn't identify the source of the odor, but his experience told him it could be anything from asbestos to mold to old chemicals that had been improperly stored. Mrs. Kowalski agreed to halt the renovation until they could determine what they were dealing with. The environmental inspection was scheduled for the following week, but Chen's curiosity got the better of him. Working carefully and wearing protective equipment, he continued removing small sections of the wall. Behind the drywall was a space approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, clearly carved out from what had once been part of the basement. The area had been sealed with plastic sheeting and filled with some kind of absorbent material that had hardened over the decades. It was when Chen began removing the plastic sheeting that he made the discovery that would change everything. Wrapped carefully in multiple layers of heavy-duty plastic and buried beneath decades of chemical absorbent were several large duffel bags. The bags were old, their fabric faded and brittle, but they had been protected from moisture and decay by the plastic wrapping. Chen's hands were shaking as he carefully opened the first bag. Inside were stacks of cash. Not just a few $100s or the kind of money someone might hide from tax collectors. These were thick bundles of bills, each stack bound with rubber bands that had long since deteriorated. The bills were old, dating back to the early 1970s, and they were in remarkably good condition considering their age. Chen counted quickly and estimated there was at least $50,000 in the first bag alone. The second bag contained more cash, along with several manila envelopes filled with documents. Chen didn't examine the documents closely, but he could see that they included photographs, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be official paperwork of some kind. The third bag was the heaviest, and when Chen opened it, he understood why the chemical smell had been so strong. This bag contained clothing, personal effects, and what appeared to be identification documents, all treated with some kind of preservative that had kept them from decomposing. Chen immediately stopped his investigation and called the police. He knew he was looking at evidence of something far more serious than a simple home renovation. The careful packaging, the chemical preservation, the hidden location behind a deliberately constructed wall, all pointed to a crime that had been methodically covered up. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide these materials, and they had succeeded for over half a century. The responding officers were initially skeptical. Hidden money wasn't uncommon in older homes, and plenty of people had found cash stashed away by previous owners who didn't trust banks. But when they saw the extent of the concealment, the professional quality of the preservation, and the obvious age of the materials, they recognized that this was something more significant than a simple case of hidden savings. Detective Maria Santos from the Denver Police Department took over the investigation. Santos had worked cold cases for over a decade and had developed an instinct for recognizing when old evidence might be connected to unsolved crimes. The careful preservation of the materials, the professional quality of the concealment, and the estimated age of the cash all suggested that this wasn't random. Someone had invested significant time, money, and effort to hide these items, and they had done so with the intention of keeping them hidden permanently. Santos began by cataloging the contents of the bag systematically. The total amount of cash was staggering, just over $4.8 million when adjusted for inflation. But it wasn't just the money that caught her attention. The documents in the manila envelopes told a story of systematic planning and careful execution. There were photographs of individuals Santos didn't recognize, handwritten notes detailing schedules and routines, and copies of official documents that appeared to be related to construction projects and business transactions. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents: Michael Garrett. Santos ran the name through the department's database and immediately found the connection to the 1971 missing person case. The address where the materials were found was less than 2 miles from the Henderson house where Garrett had been scheduled to work on the day he disappeared. The timing, the location, and the careful preservation of evidence all pointed to a connection that had been hidden for over 50 years. Santos requested the original case file and spent the next several days reviewing Detective Costa's investigation. The thoroughness of Costa's work was impressive, but he had been working without the benefit of the evidence that was now sitting in the police department's forensics lab. The documents found behind the wall provided context and connections that Costa never could have discovered through conventional investigation. The photographs in the manila envelopes showed Michael Garrett, but they weren't family photos or work-related images. These were surveillance photos, taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. They showed Garrett leaving his apartment, driving to work, stopping at a grocery store, and going about his daily routine. Someone had been watching him for weeks, documenting his movements and habits with the precision of a professional investigator. The handwritten notes were even more revealing. They detailed Garrett's schedule, his work assignments, his financial situation, and his personal relationships. The notes were written in multiple handwritings, suggesting that several people had been involved in gathering information about him. The level of detail was extraordinary, down to the specific times he left for work each morning and the routes he typically took to job sites. But it was the official documents that provided the most shocking revelation. Among the papers were copies of construction permits, business licenses, and incorporation documents for Rocky Mountain Construction, the company that had employed Garrett. The documents showed that the company had been involved in numerous projects throughout the Denver area, including several that had been completed just before Garrett's disappearance. More importantly, they showed that the company had connections to individuals and businesses that had not been part of the original investigation. Santos realized she was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond a simple missing person case. The careful documentation, the systematic surveillance, and the professional quality of the cover-up all suggested that Michael Garrett's disappearance had been part of a larger operation. The $4.8 million hidden behind the wall wasn't just money. It was payment for services rendered, evidence of a transaction that had been worth killing for. The breakthrough came when Santos discovered a pattern in the construction permits that had been hidden with the money. Rocky Mountain Construction had been involved in 6 major projects in the months leading up to Garrett's disappearance, all of them in affluent neighborhoods, all of them involving basement renovations or foundation work. What made these projects suspicious wasn't their scope or location, but their timing. Each project had been completed exactly 3 weeks before Garrett vanished, and each had involved work that provided perfect cover for activities that weren't related to construction. Santos began tracking down the original property owners from 1971. Most had moved away or passed away, but their records remained in city planning files and insurance documents. What emerged was a network of connections that Detective Costa never could have uncovered with the investigative tools available in 1971. The property owners weren't random customers who had hired Rocky Mountain Construction. They were connected through business partnerships, family relationships, and financial arrangements that created a web of mutual interests and shared secrets. The Henderson family, who had hired Garrett for the basement renovation that he never started, turned out to be central figures in this network. Richard Henderson wasn't just a homeowner looking to improve his property. He was a silent partner in several construction companies, including Rocky Mountain Construction itself. His wife, Margaret, had family connections to a concrete supply company that had provided materials for all 6 of the suspicious projects. The basement renovation that Garrett was supposed to begin wasn't a legitimate construction job. It was a setup designed to place him in a controlled environment where he could be eliminated without witnesses. But why had Michael Garrett been targeted for elimination? The answer lay in the final envelope that Santos discovered at the bottom of the 3rd duffel bag. Inside were copies of financial records that showed Garrett had stumbled onto something that threatened the entire operation. He hadn't been chosen randomly. He had been selected because he had become a liability, someone who had seen too much and asked too many questions. During his work on the previous 6 projects, Garrett had noticed inconsistencies that troubled him. Basement renovations that seemed to require far more concrete than the plans indicated. Electrical work that didn't match the permits. Storage areas that were sealed immediately after completion, before inspectors could examine them. Garrett was detail-oriented and methodical, exactly the qualities that made him a good construction worker. But those same qualities made him dangerous to people who were using construction projects as cover for activities that had nothing to do with home improvement. The documents revealed that Garrett had begun keeping his own records of the inconsistencies he observed. He had photographed unusual construction details, copied permit numbers, and even measured spaces that didn't match the official plans. He wasn't conducting a formal investigation, but his natural curiosity and professional instincts had led him to document evidence of something that wasn't legitimate. The people running the operation had noticed his attention to detail, and they had decided he was too great a risk to leave alive. The $4.8 million represented profits from an operation that had been running for over 2 years before Garrett's disappearance. Rocky Mountain Construction had been contracted to perform legitimate renovation work, but they had also been creating hidden storage spaces, installing concealment systems, and building infrastructure that served purposes far removed from typical construction projects. The basement renovations weren't just home improvements. They were part of a distribution network that moved contraband materials through affluent neighborhoods where police presence was minimal, and suspicion was unlikely. Santos discovered that the operation had been sophisticated beyond anything law enforcement had encountered in Colorado during the early 1970s. The conspirators had established legitimate businesses, obtained proper permits, and maintained professional relationships with suppliers and subcontractors. They had created a network of properties that appeared to be undergoing routine renovation work while actually serving as storage facilities and transfer points for an operation that generated millions of dollars in revenue. Garrett's disappearance had been planned months in advance. The construction job at the Henderson house was designed to place him in a location where he could be isolated and eliminated without attracting attention. The basement renovation that never began was supposed to be his final job, the place where his questions would be permanently silenced. The careful preservation of evidence behind the wall wasn't just an attempt to hide proof of murder. It was insurance, leverage that could be used against anyone who might threaten the operation in the future. The investigation revealed that Garrett had been killed on February 15, 1971, the same day he was supposed to begin work at the Henderson house. But he hadn't been killed at that location. The forensic evidence suggested he had been murdered elsewhere, and his body disposed of in a location that remained unknown. The Henderson house had been chosen as the cover story, the explanation for why Garrett had been in that area on the day he disappeared. The documents showed that the conspirators had anticipated the police investigation that would follow Garrett's disappearance. They had prepared alibis, coordinated their stories, and established explanations for any evidence that might be discovered. The truck found near the South Platte River had been placed there deliberately, wiped clean of fingerprints and positioned to suggest that Garrett had disappeared voluntarily. The timing of the discovery had been calculated to give the conspirators time to complete their cover-up before law enforcement began examining the details of Garrett's final days. Santos realized that the renovation of the Kowalski kitchen had exposed more than just evidence of a 50-year-old murder. It had revealed a criminal enterprise that had operated successfully for decades, generating enormous profits while maintaining a facade of legitimate business activity. The network of properties, the sophisticated concealment systems, and the professional quality of the documentation all suggested that the operation had continued long after Garrett's elimination. The money hidden behind the wall wasn't just payment for Garrett's murder. It was operating capital for an enterprise that had adapted and evolved over the decades. The careful preservation of the evidence suggested that the conspirators had maintained their network, updating their methods and expanding their operations while keeping the original documentation as insurance against future threats. The discovery of the hidden materials had exposed not just a cold case murder, but an ongoing criminal enterprise that had been operating in plain sight for over half a century. As Santos continued her investigation, she began to understand the full scope of what had been hidden behind that kitchen wall. The renovation that was supposed to update a family's home had instead uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that stretched back decades and involved dozens of people who had maintained their silence through careful planning, mutual benefit, and the shared knowledge that exposure would destroy them all. The $4.8 million was just the beginning. The real treasure wasn't the money itself, but the information that had been preserved alongside it. Names, dates, locations, and financial records that provided a roadmap to an operation that had successfully evaded law enforcement for over 50 years. The kitchen renovation had done more than expose a murder. It had opened a door to a criminal enterprise that was still active, still profitable, and still protected by the same careful planning that had kept Michael Garrett's disappearance unsolved for half a century. The network Santos uncovered stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. The documents revealed that Rocky Mountain Construction had been dissolved in 1973, but its operations had simply been transferred to other companies with different names and identical methods. The same individuals who had orchestrated Garrett's elimination had continued their activities under new corporate structures, maintaining the same network of properties and the same sophisticated concealment systems. What made the discovery even more shocking was the realization that several of the original conspirators were still alive and still active. The careful preservation of evidence behind the wall hadn't been the work of dead criminals trying to hide old crimes. It had been an ongoing insurance policy, maintained by people who understood that their survival depended on mutual silence and shared culpability. Santos began working with federal investigators as the scope of the case expanded beyond local jurisdiction. The financial records showed transactions that crossed state lines and involved amounts that triggered federal oversight. The operation that had begun with basement renovations in Denver had evolved into something much larger, with connections to similar networks in other cities and other states. The breakthrough that connected everything came when Santos discovered a pattern in the property transfers that had occurred over the decades. The houses involved in the original 1971 operation had changed hands multiple times, but the transfers had followed a predictable pattern. Properties were sold to buyers who held them for exactly 7 years before transferring them to new owners who were connected to the original conspirators through business partnerships or family relationships. This rotation system had served multiple purposes. It prevented any single property from being associated with the network for too long. It provided regular opportunities to update concealment systems and storage facilities, and it created a paper trail that appeared legitimate to anyone who wasn't looking for patterns. The system had been so successful that it had operated for over 50 years without attracting the attention of law enforcement or regulatory agencies. The Kowalski house had been scheduled for its next rotation in 2024. The family had unknowingly purchased a property that was part of an active criminal network, and their renovation had accidentally exposed evidence that was supposed to remain hidden for at least 2 more years. The timing of the discovery had disrupted a carefully orchestrated schedule that had been maintained for decades. Santos realized that the kitchen renovation had done more than solve a cold case murder. It had exposed an operation that was still generating revenue and still eliminating threats to its continued success. The $4.8 million hidden behind the wall represented just a fraction of the money that had been generated over the decades. The real value of the operation wasn't in the cash itself, but in the infrastructure that had been built to move money, contraband, and people through a network that law enforcement had never suspected existed. The investigation that followed was one of the largest federal operations in Colorado history. Over 200 agents were involved in simultaneous raids across 6 states, targeting properties and individuals connected to the network that had killed Michael Garrett and hidden the evidence for over 50 years. The operation, codenamed Renovation, resulted in 37 arrests and the seizure of over $60 million in cash and assets. The Henderson house, where Garrett was supposed to begin his final job, was discovered to contain a basement storage facility that had been in continuous use since 1971. The renovation that never began had been designed to expand the facility and update its concealment systems. The basement contained evidence of the network's evolution over the decades, including documentation of operations that had continued long after Garrett's elimination. Richard Henderson had died in 1998, but Margaret Henderson was among those arrested in the federal raids. At 83 years old, she had been the network's primary coordinator for over 2 decades, maintaining the rotation schedule and ensuring that evidence remained concealed. Her arrest revealed that the operation had been passed down through family lines, with children and grandchildren inheriting roles in an enterprise that had generated wealth for multiple generations. The trial that followed exposed the full scope of the conspiracy that had begun with Michael Garrett's murder. The network had been involved in money laundering, contraband distribution, and the elimination of at least 6 other individuals who had threatened the operation's security. Garrett's death had been the first in a series of murders that had been disguised as accidents, disappearances, or suicides over the decades. The forensic accounting revealed that the operation had generated over $200 million in revenue since 1971. The money had been invested in legitimate businesses, real estate, and financial instruments that provided steady returns while maintaining the appearance of lawful activity. The network had been so successful that several of its members had become prominent figures in Denver's business community, their criminal origins hidden behind decades of charitable contributions and civic involvement. For the Kowalski family, the discovery in their kitchen had transformed their lives in ways they never could have anticipated. Their home renovation had uncovered evidence that led to the largest criminal prosecution in Colorado history, but it had also made them targets of a network that had successfully eliminated threats for over 50 years. The family was relocated under federal protection while the investigation continued, their dream of a simple kitchen renovation replaced by the reality of life under assumed identities. The money discovered behind the wall was eventually returned to the federal government after lengthy legal proceedings. The Kowalski house was seized as evidence and later sold at auction, with the proceeds used to compensate victims of the network's activities. The basement renovation that Michael Garrett never completed was finally finished by federal agents who documented every detail of the concealment systems that had hidden evidence for over 5 decades. Detective Raymond Costa, who had investigated Garrett's disappearance in 1971, had died in 2019, just 3 years before the case was finally solved. His meticulous documentation and persistent investigation had provided the foundation that allowed Santos to connect the evidence discovered behind the wall to the original missing person case. Costa's widow attended the press conference where the arrests were announced, finally receiving answers to questions that had haunted her husband for decades. The contractor who made the discovery, David Chen, received a commendation from the Denver Police Department for his careful handling of the evidence and his immediate notification of authorities. His attention to detail and professional instincts had prevented the contamination of materials that provided crucial evidence in the prosecution of the network's surviving members. Michael Garrett's body was never recovered, but the evidence discovered behind the wall provided enough information to officially close his missing person case as a homicide. His sister, who had spent 50 years searching for answers, was finally able to hold a memorial service and find some measure of peace in knowing what had happened to her brother. The network that had killed Michael Garrett and hidden the evidence for over 50 years had been undone by a simple home renovation, a contractor's curiosity, and the determination of investigators who understood that some secrets can't stay buried forever. The kitchen wall that had concealed $4.8 million and evidence of multiple murders had finally been torn down, exposing a conspiracy that had operated successfully for over half a century. The case stands as a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of attention to detail, and the reality that even the most carefully planned crimes can be undone by circumstances that no one could have anticipated. Michael Garrett's disappearance had remained unsolved for 51 years, but the truth had been waiting patiently behind a kitchen wall, preserved by the same careful planning that had kept it hidden for so long.